Despite the bombardment, more than 350 anti-government protests take to the streets in Syria. "100 civilians are killed by the regime forces today, and the regime targets residential neighborhoods in Aleppo suburbs." Ibrahimi meets with Bashar al-Assad tomorrow, and the French defense minister said that al-Assad has to leave. Welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. Demonstrations swept Syrian cities and towns on the Friday that activists called Idlib's aircraft cemetery and victory's icon. Meanwhile, activists broadcasted pictures of protests that went out through the streets of the city of Salqin, despite the risks that it is witnessing due to the military operations and bombing. And we leave you with some of the footage of the demonstration chosen by the Orient News team. Activists in the city of Aleppo confirmed that the regime forces executed a group of civilians in front of their offices near the town of Al-Qura Al-Ardiyya. Meanwhile, the bombing continued on the neighborhoods of Al-Salhin, Al-Amiriyya, Masakin Hanano, Al-Sakhur, and Al-Myassar, and many others, which led to the killing and injuring of dozens of civilians. And on the other hand, many corpses were taken out from under the rubbles of Haidariya neighborhood due to the heavy bombing that targeted the town. In addition to that, heavy clashes also occurred in the neighborhood of Salah ad-Din between the Free Syrian Army and the regime forces. Also in Aleppo suburbs, the regime forces renewed its bombing on the cities and towns of Darat Izzeh, Al-Atarib, Deir Hafir, and many others.
The city of Al-Bab in the Aleppo suburbs previously joined the revolution and stood against the troubled cities against the regime, the fact that strengthened the revolution and the oust of Al-Assad's regime. The city's close and strategic position next to the city of Aleppo from the north and the east, in addition to its massive population of 80,000 people, made it a base and a strategic place for the Free Syrian Army in its battle to take control over Aleppo. In July of this year, the Free Syrian Army was able to control the city and kick the regime out of the city after fierce clashes that occurred between the two sides. This fact caused early elections, which led to forming a citizen and military councils to manage the city's affairs. Big amount of taxes were paid by the citizens of Al-Bab as a price for joining the revolution and giving shelter for refugees from other towns, especially Aleppo, in addition to standing beside and supporting the Free Syrian Army. The taxes consisted of a big amount of blood, massacres and killing that was applied on the city, the last of which was killing more than 30 civilians, including children and women, who were targeted by the regime's military planes that destroyed their house they've been taking shelter in for the past month. The citizens of the city wash away the pain of the past from the streets. Despite the constant bombing, they also changed the names of their schools and their lifestyles to pray for a better future after the regime's downfall.
The city of Aleppo and its suburbs recorded more than 83 protest points today, despite the bombing that is launched by the regime forces on the province. Meanwhile, the citizens of the towns of Al-Furqan and Bustan al-Qasr took to the streets in protest that demanded the arming of the Free Syrian Army with anti-air missiles. In the city of Al-Bab in Aleppo suburbs, the regime's military planes targeted residential buildings and led to the fall of dozens of civilians and injuring more than 50 others. Moving on to the capital, Damascus, where activists confirmed that many mortar shells fell on the neighborhoods of Al-Assali. Meanwhile, the regime forces invaded the neighborhoods of Al-Qadam and Nahar Aisha with tanks, which was followed by robbing and arrest campaigns in the neighborhoods of Jobar and Al-Mayadin. Also, the cities and towns of Damascus suburbs witnessed heavy artillery bombardment that targeted As-Sayyida Zainab. The bombing also reached many cities, including Douma. and that was targeted by the regime's warplanes. Moreover, destruction was caused in El-Zabadani, Yabrud, and Judaydat Artuz. But despite all these violations, citizens took to the streets in protest that demanded freedom and the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. To that, al-Assad regime forces killed 100 civilians in Syria until this moment. Meanwhile, a massacre was committed today by the security forces in Busra al-Sham in Dar'a. To that, the regime's tanks are besieging Al-Kashif neighborhood in the city of Dar'a, as well as they deploy snipers on the rooftops. And the regime's military and security forces stormed the town of Ghabaghib. Meanwhile, activists reported that air defense battalion fired using their heavy machine guns at civilian houses in the town of Alma, in a time when shelling renewed on the towns of Da'al and Inkhil, while huge explosions were heard in Al-Hirak. The citizens of Khirbat Ghazali in Dar'a also came out today chanting for freedom and the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. Also in the city of Tafas, in the suburbs of Dar'a, protesters took to the streets in mass demonstrations, saluting rebellious cities and demanding the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. On the other hand, mass rallies went out in the town of Ibta in Dar'a suburbs. The citizens went out supporting the city of Idlib and chanting for the Free Syrian Army. They also demanded the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. Despite the suffocating siege imposed on the city, especially the spreading of snipers on the roofs of buildings, many citizens came out after morning prayers and protests that demanded freedom in Idlib and arming the Free Syrian Army with anti-air missiles. And staying in Idlib, and despite the siege and the shelling on the city of Salqin, demonstrations came out chanting freedom and the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. On the other hand, citizens of Kafar Yahmoul in Idlib countryside came out calling for freedom and the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. Also in Idlib, the devastated city of Jericho, where protesters came out calling for freedom and supporting the Free Syrian Army. The citizens of the town of Has in Jabal Zawiya came out today chanting for freedom and supporting the besieged and devastated cities. Also in Idlib, the citizens of Ahsam also went out today in demonstrations calling for freedom as well and the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. Kafar Nubul in the countryside of Idlib also took to the streets today in the Friday, calling for freedom and the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. And staying also in Idlib, where the town of Al-Nayrab in Idlib suburbs witnessed a major displacement movement to Turkey after the difficult life conditions experienced by the people due to the continued shelling on the town. Meanwhile, aircraft bombing targeted residential buildings in the town of Kafr Takharim, which led to the fall of several victims dead and wounded, including an entire family who was targeted by the shelling. The regime forces also continued its violent bombardment on the cities of Saraqib, Taftanaz, and Salqin and neighboring villages, where shelling also renewed on the villages and the towns in the rural south and east countryside. And coming up later in the bulletin, the Syrian regime announces the 19th of this month as the beginning of the fall semester in the Syrian schools. Welcome back, you're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. And moving on to Deir ez-Zor, where the artillery bombardment continued in the city of Muhassan after the neighborhoods of Al-Hamidiyya and Al-Urfi were bombed by the regime forces. Meanwhile, warplanes launched strikes by MiG aircraft on the western village of Sayyal in the city of Al-Bukamal. Also, Al-Quriya was bombed, which destroyed several houses and led to the fall of many dead and wounded civilians. We stay in Deir ez-Zor, where the town of Ash-Shaita took to the streets in demonstrations supporting the besieged cities and condemning the crimes. Two victims were killed, including a woman, by the regime's bombing that targeted most of the neighborhoods in Homs. Meanwhile, the bombing was also renewed in the cities and towns of Al-Rastan, Talbisi, and Al-Ghantu, using rocket launchers that targeted civilian houses and mosques. This bombing led to the killing and injuring of many civilians, in addition to destroying many houses.
14/9/2012 مدينة الرسن تعرض لقصف عنيف واستهداف المساجد. إطلاق قذائف على البيوت الأمنية.
And despite the siege that is imposed by the regime on the city of Homs and the spreading of security forces around the neighborhoods of the city, the citizens of Al-Wa'ar neighborhood took to the streets in anti-government protests that demanded freedom and the overthrow of the regime. In Hamas, several were killed and injured by the bombing that targeted the neighborhood of Al-Sabuniya. Meanwhile, the regime forces invaded the neighborhoods of Al-Hamidiyya and many others, imposing a siege by its security forces. Meanwhile, in Hamas suburbs, the regime forces bombed many towns and villages, and it also carried out robbing and arrest campaigns.
مقبرة الطائرات ورمز الانتصارات بعد هجوم كتائب الأسد على قرية قراح.
Also in Hama, the citizens of the city and its suburbs took to the streets in protests that demanded freedom and the overthrow of Al-Assad's regime. Despite the fact that most of the schools in Syria are either destroyed or serve as a shelter to the displaced citizens, the Syrian regime announced the 19th of this month as the beginning of the fall semester in the Syrian schools. More in the following report.
No laughter of children near the schools or the sound of student anthems. Only the bombing and the scenes of destruction can be seen in these buildings that were one day schools for children in Syria. These areas are constantly bombed by the regime. Meanwhile, in the areas that are still under its control, the schools turned into shelters for tens of families that ran away from the regime's shellings.
هذا ما خلفه القصف المدفعي على تفتناز 14/9/2012. حتى المدارس لم تسلم منه.
The announcement made by the Syrian regime about starting the school year on the 9th of September was nothing but a joke to its own people, according to political analysts, due to the fact that the regime is constantly bombing schools, which makes it impossible for children to attend any of these schools that have turned into rubbles or shelter for displaced citizens. Unofficial statistics stated that those who live in schools add up to 500,000 displaced citizens, mostly women and children. Meanwhile, official statistics say that more than 2,000 schools have been damaged by the bombing and the clashes and are no longer valid for use, regardless of the schools that have turned into prisons and military camps for the Syrian regime. In its media game, the regime doesn't care for the lives of the Syrian people, since as long as Syria is fine, it is okay for schools to open its doors, which will probably cause the displacement of many citizens who have no shelter. Moreover, some of the students are still confused about how to afford buying school material and tuition fees, and the rest are looking for a house to reside in with their children.
Politically, the French Defense Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian said during his tour for the international emergency forces in the southern Lebanon that Bashar al-Assad has to leave. But as long as there is no decision to allow international intervention, then France will not intervene militarily. Le Drian also said that making a buffer zone in Syria is not impossible, but it should be protected and wide enough to house refugees. The United Nations Special Envoy for Refugees, Angelina Jolie, held talks with Turkish officials on Friday at the conclusion of their visit to the Turkish capital of Ankara after their visit to the Syrian refugee camps.
No one wants to live in a camp. All of these people have lost their homes and they've fled extreme violence. They've lost their families. They're very, very emotional. They're very grateful to Turkey. They're very grateful to all the border countries. They, of course, feel in many ways that they are They say that they know there is much discussion about their cause and about their situation, much discussions about the violence. There's many things on the news and many things being reported, and yet still they feel very alone and in many ways abandoned. I share in everyone's concerns about the winter approaching, with the violence and the conflict showing no signs of easing up. And the numbers growing as people are crossing the borders. It is a very large concern for all of us, and I hope we can all work together to make sure that, of course, to be blunt, nobody freezes to death in this very, very frightening time.
International and Arab League envoy to Syria Lakhdar Brahimi carried out round of talks with the foreign minister of the Syrian regime, Walid al-Muallim, and his deputy, Faisal Maghdad, that are the first of their kind since the start of his mission. Brahimi is also scheduled to meet President Bashar al-Assad. Meanwhile, his spokesman explained that the UN envoy will also hold talks with the representatives of the opposition. Pope Benedict XVI arrived in Lebanon today in a historic visit. The Pope's visit to Lebanon was to strengthen the ties between the Lebanese political parties and religious sects. In this manner, the Pope said that transporting weapons to Syria must stop, and he called on the Arab world to work towards freedom. Also, the Lebanese President, Michel Suleiman, hoped that this visit will bring peace and understanding to the people in Lebanon. And before we wrap up, here's another look at today's top stories. Despite the bombardment, more than 340 anti-government protests are taken to the streets in Syria today. 100 civilians are killed by the regime forces today, and the regime targets residential neighborhoods in Aleppo suburbs. Ibrahimi meets with Bashar al-Assad tomorrow, and the French defense minister says that al-Assad has to leave. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.